The air in Sector 7G was always the same. Recycled, tasting of chilled metal and ozone, with the faint, cloying sweetness of the nutrient paste dispensed from the communal depots. Elian traced the condensation on his window pane, his finger leaving a smear on the permaglass that looked out onto nothing but the tiered, monolithic grey of the opposite habitation block. Light was a commodity here, rationed by the consortium's automated sky domes, and the current cycle was a perpetual twilight that bled all colour from the world, leaving only shades of exhaustion. He had lived in this state of muted grey for 8 years, a ghost haunting the edges of a system that had no place for him, yet owned every molecule of his being. His life was a carefully constructed cage of anonymity, built from suppressants that leached the scent from his skin and a neural dampener that blurred the edges of his own instincts. He was an Omega, a designation that felt like a brand seared into his genetic code, but he performed the quiet, unassuming life of a beta data clerk, his movements precise, his interactions minimal, his presence as forgettable as the recycled air. Each morning, he swallowed the chalky white pill. Each night, he checked the seals on his small apartment, ensuring no trace of his true nature could leak into the sterile corridors of the block. He was a secret he kept even from himself. But secrets, like water, always find a way to the surface. It had begun subtly, a week ago. A phantom warmth coiling in his gut, a strange, restless energy that made the confines of his apartment feel smaller. The grey walls pressed closer. He had dismissed it as a malfunction in the nutrient paste, a psychosomatic response to the crushing monotony. Then came the scent. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a ghost on the edge of his senses when he woke in the sterile confines of his sleep pod. Not the ozonic sterility of the sector, but something organic, wild, something his. It smelled of rain-soaked earth and bruised night-blooming jasmine, a scent he hadn't experienced since the day of his presentation, the day his world had fractured. The memory was a shard of glass embedded in his mind, its edges still sharp enough to draw blood. The sterile white of the assessment center, the cold pressure of the diagnostic cuffs on his wrists, and the suffocating bloom of his own scent filling the air for the first time. And then him, Cadet Valerius, an alpha, pristine in his black and silver uniform, his posture a study in rigid control. He had been brought in to demonstrate the power of the Nexus, the fated bond the consortium deemed a genetic flaw, a dangerous variable in their equation of absolute order. Elian remembered the exact moment their eyes met across the room. It wasn't a glance. It was a collision. The world had dissolved into a roaring inferno of sensation. Valerius's scent of cold steel, winter pine, and distant storms crashing over him. A primal recognition that sang in his blood, a feeling of coming home to a place he'd never known. He had felt the bond snap into place, a luminous, unbreakable thread connecting their very souls. Hope, terrifying and beautiful, had surged through him. Then came the rejection. Valerius's face, sculpted from marble and discipline, had gone blank. A flicker of something, shock, pain, a terrifying vulnerability, had crossed his features for a fraction of a second before a mask of pure chilling control slammed down. He had taken one precise step back, the movement economical and sharp. His voice, when he spoke to the assessor, was devoid of all emotion, a blade of ice. The subject is incompatible. The nexus is unstable, a genetic misfire. Each word had been a hammer blow, shattering the fragile, luminous thing that had just been born between them. He had not looked at Elian again. He simply turned, his back a rigid wall of denial, and walked away, leaving Elian drowning in the sudden, echoing silence of a severed connection. The bond hadn't broken. It couldn't, but it had been violently refused, left to fester like an open wound. They had classified him as a volatile Omega, slapped him with a lifetime prescription of the strongest suppressants, and cast him into the anonymous grey of the lower sectors. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a mistake to be erased. Now, that mistake was coming undone. The warmth in his belly was no longer a phantom. It was a slow-burning fire. The scent clinging to his sleep linens was stronger this morning, a defiant whisper of jasmine in the sterile air. The pill he swallowed felt like dust on his tongue, its chemical certainty failing against the rising tide of his own biology. He looked at his reflection in the dark window, a pale, haunted face staring back. The grey was no longer a cage, it was a tomb, and something inside him, something wild and long dormant, was beginning to claw its way out. The ghost of a bond, a connection he had tried to kill for 8 years, pulsed with a faint, insistent beat, a distant drum heralding a storm he knew he could not escape. It was a terrifying premonition, a certainty that settled cold and heavy in his bones. Valerius would feel it too. The hunter would feel the stirrings of his prey. The first tremor of it hit him in the middle of his work shift, a jolt so profound he dropped the data slate he was calibrating. It shattered on the composite floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed drone of the data archive. A phantom sensation, sharp and invasive, sliced through the fog of his neural dampener. It was not his own feeling. It was a cold, focused surge of awareness, of discovery, aimed directly at him. A searchlight beam finding its target in the dark. He felt a phantom chill, the scent of winter pine and ozone ghosting through his senses. So real, he instinctively looked over his shoulder. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the carefully constructed calm he wore, like a uniform. They knew. He knew. The bond, dormant for so long, was transmitting again, a two-way line he had thought was dead. He felt the pull, the undeniable tug of that connection, not as a memory this time, but as a live wire. Valerius was looking for him. The realization was not a thought. It was a primal certainty that bypassed reason and went straight to the survival instinct buried beneath years of suppression. He had to run. He didn't bother logging out of his terminal or retrieving his personal effects. There was nothing personal to retrieve. His life was a shell. He walked, not ran, out of the archive, his movements measured, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, while inside, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The corridors of the consortium block felt different now, the grey walls no longer passive but watchful. The omnipresent hum of the building's life support systems sounded like a low growl. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every passing enforcer a potential captor. He made it to his apartment, the door hissing shut behind him, sealing him in with his escalating fear. The scent in the room was stronger now, a clear, sweet note of jasmine and rain that clung to everything. His scent. It was a declaration of his existence, a beacon in the sterile world. He ripped open the floor panel beneath his sleep pod, his hands trembling. Inside was a small, waterproof satchel he had prepared years ago, a paranoid fantasy that had just become his only reality. It contained a few nutrient bars, a water purifier, a set of untraceable clothes, and his last remaining vials of black market suppressants, weaker than his prescription, but his only hope of masking his trail. He could feel the clock ticking, the invisible net drawing tighter. The pull from Valerius was a constant, low-level thrum at the base of his skull, a compass needle pointing towards his hunter. He had to break the connection, or at least disrupt it. He moved to the small sanitation unit, his reflection in the polished chrome, a stranger's face, pale, wide-eyed, stripped of its placid mask. He took the sonic razor from its magnetic clip, the hum vibrating through his hand. With a deep, shuddering breath, he began to shave his head, the dark hair falling in soft clumps to the floor. It was a desperate, symbolic act, a shedding of his old identity, a way to change the scent profile that clung to his hair. He was no longer Elian, the beta data clerk. He was just prey. He worked quickly, his movements becoming more fluid, more instinctual. He changed into the rough, dark synth fabric of the runner's clothes. He injected the weaker suppressant into his thigh, the sting, a sharp, grounding pain. It wouldn't hide him completely, not from an alpha with a bonded connection, but it might buy him time. It might muddy the signal. As he was about to leave, his eyes fell on the shattered data slate he'd carried home from work, its screen dark. Idea, reckless and insane, sparked in his mind. A message, a final act of defiance against the man who had broken him and was now hunting him. He powered it on, the screen flickering to life. His fingers flew across the cracked surface, typing a single, encrypted string of code. A comm frequency, old and unsecured, one they had used as cadets in a training simulation an eternity ago. He attached no message, no name, just the frequency. It was a taunt, a challenge. It said, "You know who this is? You know what you did? Come and find me." He wiped the slate, set it to transmit the signal on a repeating loop, and left it on the floor. It was an act of madness, a beacon for the man he was fleeing. But it was also the first choice he had made for himself in 8 years. He slipped out of his apartment and into the service tunnels, the darkness swallowing him whole. The recycled air of the upper sectors gave way to the damp, metallic tang of the underlevels. Down here, the grey conformity of the consortium frayed at the edges. Down here, a ghost could disappear. But as he ran, the cold, insistent pull of the bond followed him, a silver thread in the labyrinthine dark, a promise that this was not an escape. It was merely the beginning of the hunt. And for the first time, a sliver of something other than fear pierced through him, a cold, hard anger. He would not be prey. He would not be a mistake to be erased. If Valerius wanted him, he would have to catch him, and the chase would cost him everything. The bridge of the Enforcer flagship, the Vigilance, was a cathedral of cold light and silence. Holographic displays floated in the star-dusted dark, streams of data flowing in silent, orderly rivers of turquoise and silver. At its center, standing before the main star chart, was Captain Valerius. His uniform was immaculate, the silver piping on his black tunic catching the light, his posture a testament to a lifetime of brutal discipline. To his subordinates, he was the epitome of the consortium's ideals, logical, unflinching, a perfect instrument of order. His face, which others had once called beautiful, was now a mask of severe control, his silver eyes holding the cold, distant light of a dying star. No one on the bridge could perceive the war raging within him. It had begun as a subtle dissonance an hour ago, a flicker beneath the surface of his consciousness, like a ghost signal interrupting a clean transmission. He had dismissed it as fatigue. Then the signal had stabilized, strengthened, blooming into a scent he had locked away in the deepest, most fortified vault of his memory. Rain-soaked earth, night-blooming jasmine. Elian. The name was a blade twisting in his gut. The bond, the nexus he had renounced, the genetic flaw he had cauterized with pure, cold will, was screaming. It was a high-frequency siren in his blood, a psychic resonance that made the sterile air of the bridge feel thick and suffocating. "Report." His voice was steady, betraying none of the chaos threatening to overwhelm his senses. Lieutenant Kale, his second-in-command, stepped forward, his own beta senses oblivious to the storm battering his captain. "Sir, a biological signature anomaly has been flagged in Sector 7G. Unregistered Omega. Potency is fluctuating but high. Class 4, possibly higher." Kyle gestured to a display, and a map of the sector bloomed in the air. A single point of light pulsed, a soft, seductive gold against the grid-like blue of the city schematics. Valerius stared at the light, and for a moment the data streams, the star chart, the very bridge around him seemed to dissolve. He was back in the assessment center, a boy of 17, arrogant and certain in his indoctrination. He saw a pair of terrified, hopeful brown eyes and felt the cataclysmic, world-altering snap of the nexus locking into place. He felt the raw, untamed power of it, a force of nature that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed identity, his ambition, his entire world-view. The consortium taught that the nexus was a vulnerability, a primal chain that enslaved alphas to omegas, reason to instinct, a weakness to be purged. And he, Valerius, was destined for greatness. He would not be weakened. He would not be chained. The memory of his own voice echoed in his mind, cold and clinical, incompatible, unstable, a misfire, the greatest lie he had ever told, a lie he had built his entire life upon. "The signature is moving," Kale continued, his voice pulling Valerius back to the present. "Descending into the lower service conduits, it's erratic, evasive." Valerius's gaze sharpened. The golden pulse was indeed moving, a frantic, desperate path through the city's hidden veins. He could feel it. He could feel Elian's panic, his desperation, a frantic pulse transmitted directly into his own mind through the bond. The sensation was agonizing, an empathic feedback loop he had no defense against. He felt a primal, possessive urge rise within him, a deep, guttural growl that started in his chest. Mine. The thought was not his own. It was the alpha, the beast he kept caged and starved, roaring to be let out. He had to contain this. He had to capture the source of this chaos before it shattered his control completely. "Seal all transit points below Sector 5. Deploy Harrier units to sublevels 3 and 4. I want thermal and biometric sweeps of the entire grid," he commanded, his voice a whip crack of authority. "Set a containment perimeter. Nothing gets out." The officers on the bridge moved with crisp efficiency, their actions a ballet of silent obedience. But Valerius was no longer focused on them. His attention was fixed on that single, golden light. He was hunting a ghost from his past, a mistake he had tried to bury. But it was more than that. He was hunting the only thing in the universe that had ever made him feel anything other than the cold vacuum of control. A quiet chime drew his attention to his private console. A new signal had been detected, originating from the anomaly's last known location. It was a simple, repeating broadcast, a comm frequency. His blood ran cold. It was his old cadet channel, a channel only one other person would remember. It was a ghost whispering his name across 8 years of silence. It was a challenge, a deliberate, defiant act, a flicker of something akin to admiration, hot and dangerous, sparked within him. Elian was not just running, he was fighting back. "Lieutenant," Valerius said, his voice dangerously soft, "divert the vigilance. I am taking personal command of the ground unit. On screen, magnify Sector 7G. I want to see everything." The hunt was no longer a matter of duty. It was a matter of survival. His own. The underlevels were a different world, a labyrinth of rust and shadow, where the consortium's sterile order decayed into something more organic, more chaotic. The air was thick with the smells of damp metal, ozone from sparking conduits, and the faint, bitter scent of the desperate people who carved out lives in the city's forgotten depths. For Elian, it was a sensory assault. After years of recycled air and muted scents, the raw, unfiltered reality of the underbelly was overwhelming, but it was also a shield. His own scent, the jasmine and rain that felt like a beacon, was now just one note in a cacophony of smells, making him harder to pinpoint. He ran, his body moving with an instinctual grace he hadn't known he possessed. The years of suppression had not destroyed the Omega within him. They had only caged it. Now, the cage was broken. His senses were razor-sharp. He could hear the drip of water in a pipe 100 meters away, see the subtle shift of air currents in the dim light, smell the approach of the enforcer patrols before he saw their helmet-mounted beams cutting through the gloom. They were clumsy, loud, their movements constrained by their bulky armor and their reliance on technology. They were hunting a data point on a map. They were not hunting him. Only one person was truly hunting him: Valerius. The pull of the bond was a constant, aching pressure behind his eyes. It was a homing beacon, and he was the target. But it was also his greatest advantage. It was a two-way connection. Through it, he could feel the cold, analytical focus of the hunt, the strategies being deployed, the net being cast. And he could feel Valerius himself. He could feel the ironclad control, but underneath it, he could sense the hairline fractures, the strain of a man at war with his own nature. He felt the Alpha's frustration when a patrol missed him by meters, a phantom surge of irritation that was not his own. He felt a flicker of possessive fury when another enforcer got too close. It was a terrifying intimacy, a violation of his mind, but he clung to it, using it to stay one step ahead. He navigated the maze of tunnels and gantries, a ghost in the machine. He moved through the hidden settlements of the underlevel dwellers, the stateless, who saw his desperation and offered him a moment's cover, a piece of dried nutrient bar, a whispered warning about a patrol route. They saw the mark of the hunted on him and recognized a kindred spirit. They were the system's mistakes, just like him. They were the variables the consortium couldn't control. Hours bled into a timeless stretch of flight and evasion. The weaker suppressant was wearing off, and the first true signs of his heat were beginning to manifest. A deep, persistent ache settled in his bones, and a feverish heat began to build beneath his skin. His scent was intensifying, becoming richer, more complex, a desperate plea from his body to find his mate. The bond amplified it, transmitting his state directly to Valerius, a siren call of distress and need. He knew he was running out of time. The enforcers were adapting, their movements becoming more coordinated. Valerius was learning his patterns, anticipating his feints. The hunter was closing in. He found himself trapped in a defunct water reclamation plant, a cavernous space filled with the skeletons of giant, silent machinery. The air was heavy with the smell of stagnant water and rust. There were only 2 exits, and he could hear the rhythmic clank of enforcer boots approaching both. The net had closed. He scrambled up a rusted catwalk, pressing himself into the shadows behind a massive turbine. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and the onset of the fever. The pull of the bond intensified dramatically. It was no longer a distant thrum. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air. He was close. Elian peered through the grated floor of the catwalk. Below, a figure emerged from the darkness, moving with a predator's silence that was utterly unlike the other enforcers. He wore the same black armor, but his helmet was retracted, revealing a face that was both intimately familiar and terrifyingly strange. Captain Valerius. 8 years had carved new lines of severity into his features, but his eyes were the same, the color of a winter sky, cold and piercing. He moved into the center of the vast chamber, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. He was scenting the air. He was tracking Elian not with technology, but with the raw instinct he had so long denied. Their gazes met through the grate. The world stopped. The roaring in Elian's ears faded to a pinpoint of absolute silence. In that moment, there was no hunter, no prey. There was only the bond, a blazing, undeniable reality that arced between them, so powerful it felt as if the very air had caught fire. Valerius's control finally fractured. For a heartbeat, Elian saw not the cold captain, but the 17-year-old boy from the assessment center, his eyes wide with a terrifying, beautiful recognition. The hunter had found his mark, and in doing so, had found himself utterly, irrevocably lost. The silence in the reclamation plant was a living thing, thick and heavy with the weight of 8 years of unspoken history. Valerius stood frozen on the floor below, his silver eyes locked on Elian's shadowed form. The carefully constructed walls of his discipline, the bedrock of his entire existence, were crumbling into dust. The scent in the air was intoxicating, a symphony of jasmine and rain and a deep, aching need that bypassed his logic and spoke directly to the alpha chained in his soul. It was the scent of his own undoing. He saw the tremor in Elian's hands as he gripped the railing of the catwalk, the defiant terror in his eyes. He was not the broken, volatile Omega from the consortium's file. He was fierce. He was beautiful. He was his. The possessive, primal thought slammed into him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He raised his hand, a slow, deliberate motion, and spoke into his comlink, his voice a low command that brooked no argument. "All units, pull back to the perimeter. I will handle this myself." He heard Lieutenant Kale's hesitant reply. "Sir, protocol dictates—" "Now, Lieutenant." Valerius cut him off, his voice dropping to a near growl. The comm clicked into silence. He was alone with him. Alone with the catastrophic truth he had run from his entire life. He took a step forward, the sound of his boot on the metal floor echoing in the vast, dead space. Elian flinched, pressing himself further into the shadows. "Don't run," Valerius said, his voice rougher than he intended, raw with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. He could feel Elian's fear through the bond, a sharp, bitter taste on his tongue, and it was agonizing. He was the source of that fear. He who was biologically imprinted to protect and cherish this Omega, was hunting him like an animal. The irony was a blade in his own heart. "I won't let them hurt you," he added, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate. How could he explain the war inside him? That he was hunting Elian not to destroy him, but because the alternative, letting him go, losing this connection again, was a void so terrifying he couldn't face it. He was a man dying of thirst, and Elian was the only source of water in a universe of sand. He needed to contain him, to control the situation, to bring this overwhelming chaos back into some semblance of order. But the Omega on the catwalk was the very definition of chaos, a beautiful, wild thing that defied every rule he had ever lived by. Elian didn't respond. He just watched, his knuckles white on the railing. The fever from his impending heat was painting flushed tones on his pale skin, and his scent was growing stronger with every passing second, a sweet, heady perfume that was systematically dismantling Valerius's sanity. The alpha in him wanted to climb that catwalk, to close the distance, to soothe the trembling, to cover the Omega with his own scent, to claim what was his. The captain in him screamed for containment, for protocol, for the cold, sterile certainty of a detention cell and a medical team. The two impulses ripped him in half. He saw the moment Elian made his decision. A flicker of resolve hardened his gaze. He wasn't going to surrender. He wasn't going to wait to be captured. With a sudden, desperate burst of energy, he turned and ran, disappearing down the length of the catwalk into the deeper shadows of the plant. The bond flared with his panic and his flight. Valerius's instinct took over. He didn't think. He just moved. He launched himself at the nearest support pillar, his armored gloves at finding purchase on the rusted metal, and began to climb, his movements swift and sure. He reached the catwalk in seconds, landing in a silent crouch. The scent trail was overpowering here. He followed it into the labyrinth of dead machinery, his senses alive, the hunter fully unleashed. He found Elian at a dead end, a sheer drop to the churning, dark water of the reclamation tanks below. He was trapped. He turned to face Valerius, his chest heaving, his face a mask of desperate defiance. There was nowhere left to run. They stood 10 feet apart, the air between them thick enough to taste. "It's over, Elian," Valerius said, his voice softer this time. He took a slow step forward. Elian took a step back, his heel at the very edge of the precipice. "Stay back," he warned, his voice shaking but laced with steel. Valerius stopped. He could see the truth in Elian's eyes. He would jump before he let himself be taken. He would choose oblivion over a cage. And in that moment, the entire construct of Valerius's life, his duty, his ambition, his cold, hard logic, became utterly meaningless. The thought of Elian disappearing into that dark water, of the bond snapping silent forever, was a pain more profound than anything he had ever imagined. It was an extinction event for his soul. Without conscious thought, he reached up and unsealed his helmet, pulling it off and letting it fall to the floor with a clang. He stood before Elian, stripped of his authority, of his uniform's protection. Just a man, an alpha, his alpha. "I won't let you fall," he said, the words a vow. And then he did the one thing his training, his indoctrination, his entire being screamed at him not to do. He broke protocol. He broke faith with the consortium. He turned his back on the hunt, took a deliberate step away from Elian, and created an opening, a path to escape. "Go," he whispered, the word torn from his throat. For a long, silent moment, Elian just stared at him, his expression a maelstrom of shock and disbelief. Then, with a final, searching look that Valerius would never forget, he fled. Valerius stood there, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance, the bond between them now a raw, open wound, throbbing with confusion, fear, and a tiny, impossible spark of hope. He had come to capture a mistake. Instead, he had set his own soul free, and in doing so had condemned himself completely. The darkness of the undertunnels was a comfort after the stark, confrontational light of the reclamation plant. Elian ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed in protest, putting as much distance as possible between himself and Valerius. But there was no escaping the echo of that final moment. Go. The word replayed in his mind, a single, impossible note of grace in an opera of cruelty. Valerius had let him go. The hunter had opened the cage. The act made no sense. It contradicted everything Elian knew about the man, about the system he served. It was a crack in the monolithic facade of the consortium, a hint that the man who had rejected him was not the monster he had believed him to be, but something far more complex, far more tortured. The thought was a dangerous seed of hope planted in the barren soil of his despair. He pushed it down. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was still being hunted, even if the primary hunter had momentarily faltered. The perimeter was still in place. He was still an anomaly, a fugitive Omega whose heat was growing closer with every frantic heartbeat. The fever was a constant companion now, a fire in his blood that made his thoughts swim and his body ache with a profound, cellular loneliness. He stumbled through the tunnels, his borrowed time ticking away, until a hand shot out from a darkened alcove and pulled him into the shadows. He instinctively fought back, a snarl tearing from his throat, but a calm, firm voice cut through his panic. Easy now. We saw what happened at the plant. We're not with them. His vision cleared, focusing on the face of a woman with kind eyes and streaks of grey in her dark hair. She wore the patched, utilitarian clothing of the stateless. Behind her stood two others, their expressions wary but not hostile. You're the one they're tearing the sectors apart for, the woman, whose name was Anya, stated. You're putting all of us at risk. I didn't ask for this, Elian rasped, his body slumping against the cold wall, the last of his adrenaline draining away. None of us did, Anya replied, her voice softening with empathy. The consortium decides what you are, and you spend the rest of your life running from it. Come, you can't stay out here. Your scent will draw every enforcer in the grid. They led him deeper into the hidden pathways of the underlevels, through a series of sealed pressure doors and camouflaged tunnels, until they emerged into a vast, hidden cavern. It was a makeshift city, cobbled together from salvaged parts and powered by a geothermal vent that filled the air with a constant, warm hum. Lights were strung between gantries, illuminating clusters of dwellings, hydroponic gardens, and a marketplace teeming with the quiet, determined energy of a people who refused to be erased. This was sanctuary. A rumor he'd thought was a desperate fantasy. It was real. They took him to a small medical bay, a clean, well-lit space run by an old beta named Reese. Reese scanned him with a handheld device, his brow furrowed. Suppressants have failed completely. You're in full preheat. It's going to break within the next 12 hours. The clinical diagnosis landed with the weight of a death sentence. An unbonded Omega's heat in the middle of a city-wide manhunt was suicide. The Alpha, Reese continued, his gaze sharp. The one who let you go. Is he your... Elian couldn't bring himself to nod, but the medic understood. A forced rejection. Vicious. The bond is frayed, but it's still active. That's why he's so obsessed. Why he can track you. It's driving him as mad as it's driving you. For the first time, Elian considered Valerius's side of the bond not as a hunter's tool, but as a source of torment. The idea of the cold, controlled captain being driven mad by their connection was a strange, unsettling thought. Anya gave him a change of clothes and a warm nutrient broth that soothed the ache in his stomach. The consortium fears the Nexus more than anything, she explained, sitting across from him in the quiet med bay. They call it a flaw, a chaotic element, but it's not. It's a source of power they can't quantify, can't control. They try to sever them, suppress them, but all they do is create wounds. Wounded people are easier to manage. She looked at him, her expression serious. That captain, he didn't let you go out of kindness. He did it because a part of him, the part the consortium couldn't brainwash, recognized you. The bond is fighting back. It's trying to heal itself. The words resonated deep within him. He thought of the look in Valerius's eyes, not just the hunter, but the lost boy beneath. He was a prisoner too, trapped in a cage of his own making. Elian's anger, the cold, hard thing that had fueled his flight, began to soften, replaced by a complex, aching pity. They were two halves of a whole, both broken by the same system. Over the next few hours, as the fever climbed and the world began to blur at the edges, Elian listened. Anya and the others told him stories of other bonded pairs, hunted and separated by the consortium. They spoke of the strength a true bond could provide, an empathic and psychic connection that could be a shield, a weapon, a sanctuary in itself. They were teaching him, showing him that what he had seen as a curse could be his salvation. His Omega nature, his scent, his heat, the very bond that had brought him so much pain. These were not weaknesses. They were his truth, his power. As the first powerful wave of the heat washed over him, a dizzying, painful crest of need and raw instinct, a new resolve settled in his heart. He would not hide from this. He would not let it destroy him. He would face it. And he would not face it alone. He had to reach Valerius again, not as prey, but as an equal. He had to force a final confrontation to make him choose, once and for all, between the sterile order of the consortium and the chaotic, beautiful truth of their bond. The hunter had let him go once. Now, Elian would turn the tables. He would become the beacon, and he would make the hunter come home. Failure was a foreign concept to Captain Valerius. In his meticulously structured life, there were only objectives and outcomes, all of which were achieved through superior strategy and unwavering will. Yet failure was the only word that could describe the acrid taste in his mouth as he stood before the consortium's sector command. The holographic image of Administrator Thorne shimmered before him, his face a bland mask of bureaucratic displeasure. "You had the asset cornered, Captain." Thorne's voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. "You had a full battalion at your disposal. Explain how a single, unconditioned Omega managed to evade you." Valerius's report had been a masterpiece of tactical obfuscation. He cited structural instabilities in the reclamation plant, risk of collateral damage, the asset's unpredictable behavior. He omitted the part where he had looked into Elian's eyes, and his universe had tilted on its axis. He emitted the word he had spoken, go. The asset exploited a previously unmapped conduit. My decision was to secure the perimeter and prevent a wider breach, Valerius stated, his voice a monotone of pure, cold logic. He was lying to his superior officer, an act of treason he had never imagined himself capable of. The lie felt surprisingly natural, a necessary shield around the raw, vulnerable truth of what had happened. Thorn was silent for a moment, his digital eyes seeming to peer directly into Valerius's soul. Your performance has been irregular, Captain. Your obsession with this particular case is noted. You are being temporarily relieved of field command. Return to the Vigilance. We will handle the asset's retrieval. The transmission ended, leaving Valerius alone in the silent command center. Relieved of command. Benched. The words should have stung, a blow to his pride and his career. Instead, he felt a profound, chilling sense of dread. They would handle it. They would send in a team of soulless enforcers armed with tranquilizer darts and containment foam. They would treat Elian like a rabid animal, a problem to be neutralized. They would not see the defiance in his eyes, the strength that had carried him this far. They would break him, drug him, and lock him away in a sterile lab until he was no longer a person, just a collection of valuable genetic data. The alpha in him, the one he had denied for so long, roared in protest. A wave of possessive, protective fury washed over him, so potent it made him physically stagger. The sterile air of the command center seemed to choke him. He had to get out. Back on the Vigilance, in the Spartan privacy of his quarters, the mask of control finally shattered. He tore off his gloves, his tunic, pacing the confines of the small room like a caged wolf. The bond, which had been a low thrum, was now a screaming siren. He could feel Elian's state as if it were his own. The rising fever, the deep cellular ache of the approaching heat, the waves of desperate, overwhelming need. It was an agony, a constant sensory bombardment that was tearing his sanity apart. He stumbled to his personal medical dispenser and keyed in the code for a high-dose neural dampener. The auto-injector hissed against his neck, flooding his system with chemicals designed to deaden nerve endings, to silence the storm in his blood. For a moment, there was relief. The roaring of the bond subsided to a dull, distant ache. The world sharpened back into cold, logical lines. But the silence was worse. In the chemical void, the memory of Elian's face rushed in to fill the emptiness. The terror in his eyes, the desperation, the sheer, unyielding will to be free. Valerius sank onto the edge of his bunk, his head in his hands. His entire life had been a pursuit of perfection, of control. He was the consortium's finest weapon, a man who had successfully purged himself of all weakness, all sentiment, all instinct. He had believed in the system, in its promise of order born from the suppression of chaotic nature. He had rejected Elian to prove his loyalty to that ideal, to prove his own strength. But he had not been strong. He had been a coward. He hadn't severed a weakness. He had severed his own soul. The pain of that rejection, he now realized, he had inflicted not only on Elian, but on himself. He had spent 8 years living in the sterile, silent void he had created that day. The hunt had not been about duty. It had been about filling that void. He had been hunting for the part of himself he had thrown away. The neural dampener was already starting to fail. The bond was too strong, a fundamental force of their shared biology that no chemical could fully suppress. Elian's feverish heat pulsed through the connection, a desperate SOS that Valerius could feel in the marrow of his bones. He was in pain, he was in danger, and the consortium was sending its jackals to collect him. The choice, when it finally presented itself, was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. He stood up, his movements once again precise, but this time they were not driven by duty or logic. They were driven by a singular, primal purpose. He strapped on his sidearm, pulled on his gloves, and bypassed the lock on his own quarters. He was breaking protocol. He was breaking his oaths. He was becoming the one thing he had always despised, a rogue element, a slave to instinct. He walked through the corridors of his own ship, a ghost moving against the tide of order, heading for the shuttle bay. He had to get to Elian first, not to capture him, not to contain him, to save him. Back in the sanctuary's med bay, the world had dissolved into a fever dream for Elian. The heat was upon him fully now, a relentless, crashing tide of instinct and sensation. The quiet concern of Anya and Rhys faded to a distant hum. The walls of the room seemed to breathe with him, and the air itself felt thick, charged with his scent, which was now a powerful, undeniable broadcast of his need. It was a scent meant for only one person, a call across the void. His body was no longer his own. It was an instrument of pure biological imperative, aching for a completion it had been denied for 8 years. In the moments of clarity between the waves of fever, a terrifying thought took hold. What if Valerius didn't come? What if his duty, his conditioning, was stronger than the bond? What if the man who let him go had been a momentary aberration, already corrected and purged? The fear was a shard of ice in the furnace of his heat. An unbonded heat was not just painful, it was dangerous. It could break an Omega's mind, leaving them lost in a spiral of instinct from which they might never recover. He was balanced on a knife's edge, and he could feel himself slipping. He focused on the bond, the single luminous thread in the raging storm of his senses. He pushed his consciousness along it, a desperate, silent plea. Find me, please. Find me. He poured all his fear, his pain, his desperate, fragile hope into that connection, using it not as a receiver, but as a transmitter. He was making himself a beacon, a lighthouse in the storm, praying his captain would see the light and steer for shore. Meanwhile, Valerius was a phantom in the machine. He stole a low-profile civilian skimmer from the shuttle bay, its energy signature easily lost in the dense traffic of the mid-levels. He was a fugitive now, a traitor to the system he had sworn to uphold. The realization brought with it not fear, but a strange, exhilarating sense of liberation. He was finally free from the crushing weight of perfection. The bond was his only guide, a raw, empathic compass needle pointing him down into the city's depths. He could feel Elian's fever, his pain, the powerful, seductive pull of his heat, and it was a fire in his own blood. The alpha, so long suppressed, was now at the helm, its senses sharp, its purpose absolute. Find his mate. He landed the skimmer in a deserted freight yard on the edge of the lower levels and continued on foot, melting into the shadows. He could smell Elian's scent on the air now, a faint but unmistakable trace of rain and jasmine, a thread of gold in the tapestry of the undersector's smells. The consortium would be tracking him, he knew. Administrator Thorn was not a fool. They would have noted his unauthorized departure. They would be hunting him now, too. The hunter had become the hunted. It was a perfect, terrible irony. He found the hidden entrance to sanctuary not by sight, but by following the scent, which grew stronger and more concentrated as he drew near. He bypassed the outer lock with a sequence of codes he hadn't used in a decade, from his early days in tactical training, designed to infiltrate exactly these kinds of off-grid settlements. The door hissed open, and he stepped inside. The warm, humid air of the cavern hit him, rich with the smells of growing things, of people, and overwhelmingly of Elian. The alpha in him wanted to roar, to announce his presence, to claim his territory. He forced it down, reining in the instinct with the tattered remnants of his discipline. He moved through the settlement like a shadow, his black uniform a stark contrast to the patched, worn clothing of the stateless who watched him pass with suspicious eyes. He didn't care. His focus was singular, absolute. The scent led him to the medical bay. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the release panel. He could feel Elian's presence on the other side, a blazing sun of heat and need. He was afraid. For the first time since he was a child, Valerius felt the cold, sharp sting of fear. He was afraid of what he would find. He was afraid of the man he had been and the damage he had done. He was afraid that he was too late. He took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of his Omega filling him, grounding him, giving him strength. Then he opened the door. Elian was lying on a cot, his body trembling, his skin flushed with fever. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of pain. And yet he was the most beautiful thing Valerius had ever seen. As if sensing his presence, Elian's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused for a moment, clouded with fever, and then they locked on Valerius. The pain in them was replaced by a surge of raw, unadulterated shock. And then something else, a flicker of hope, a question. Valerius crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt by the cot, his movements stripped of all military precision, full of a hesitant, desperate tenderness. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently brushed a damp strand of hair from Elian's forehead. The moment his skin touched Elian's, the bond flared between them, a massive, explosive release of 8 years of pent-up energy. It was not a collision this time. It was a homecoming. In that single, silent touch, a universe of pain, regret, and longing was exchanged. "I'm here," Valerius projected through the bond, the thought as clear as a spoken word. "I'm sorry. I'm here." The contact was electric, a jolt of pure energy that arced from Valerius's fingertips and into Elian's very soul. The world, which had been a blur of fever and pain, snapped into sharp, brilliant focus. All of it centered on the man kneeling beside him. The scent of winter pine, cold steel, and storms filled his senses, not as a threat, but as an anchor. It was the scent of his alpha, and it was the only thing that mattered. Valerius's face was stripped bare of its captain's mask. Elian could see the exhaustion, the fear, and a profound, bone-deep regret in the depths of his silver eyes. He was not here as an enforcer. He was not here to capture him. He was here for him. The realization was so overwhelming that a sob, tight with 8 years of grief, broke from Elian's lips. The waves of the heat, which had been agonizing, battering him relentlessly, suddenly gentled. The presence of his bonded alpha was like a balm on his frayed nerves, a deep, resonant hum that soothed the frantic screaming of his own biology. The pain was still there, the need was still a furnace in his core, but it was no longer a destructive force. It had found its purpose. It had found its home. "Valerius," he whispered, his voice hoarse, the name tasting like a prayer on his tongue. Valerius flinched as if struck. Hearing his name spoken with such raw vulnerability shattered the last of his defenses. "I should never have left you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I did, everything I was. It was a mistake, a lie." He gently took Elian's hand, lacing their fingers together. The simple gesture felt more intimate, more profound than any grand declaration. It was a physical manifestation of the bond reasserting itself, of two broken halves beginning to mend. Outside the medbay, Anya and Reese watched through a small viewport, their expressions a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had seen the Alpha arrive, a spectre of the system that hunted them, but they had also seen the desperate, unguarded look on his face. This was not an arrest. This was a surrender. Suddenly, the sanctuary's alert klaxon blared, a harsh, grating sound that cut through the tender silence in the room. Red lights flashed, painting the cavern in pulses of emergency crimson. "Consortium breach," a voice yelled from the main cavern. "Enforcers at the north gate." Valerius was on his feet in an instant, his soldier's instincts taking over. He pulled Elian into a sitting position, his movements efficient and protective. "They followed me," he said, his voice grim. "Or they tracked you. It doesn't matter. We have to move. Now." The heat, however, had other plans. The adrenaline and the sudden danger sent another powerful wave crashing through Elian, stronger than any before. His body arched, a cry of pure, overwhelming need torn from his throat. He was in no condition to run. His legs wouldn't hold him. The scent he was releasing, amplified by his distress, would be an undeniable beacon to every Alpha in the Enforcer squad. They were trapped. "I can't," Elian gasped, clutching at Valerius's arm, his knuckles white. "I can't move." Valerius looked from Elian's agonized face to the door, his mind racing, calculating odds, running tactical scenarios. All of them ended in capture. There was no escape, not this time. But then his gaze fell on Elian's neck, on the scent gland there, flushed and pulsing with his heat. There was one other option, a dangerous, irreversible, and deeply primal one. It was the one thing the Consortium feared most, the completion of a bond, a claiming. It would merge their sense, making Elian almost impossible for other Alphas to track. It would stabilize his heat, giving him the strength to move, and it would tie them together, soul to soul, for eternity. It was a choice that would utterly destroy Captain Valerius and fully birth Valerius, the Alpha. "Elian," he said, his voice low and intense, his silver eyes boring into his. "Listen to me. There is a way, but you have to trust me. You have to let me in. Completely." Elian looked into his eyes and saw no deception, no cold calculation. He saw only a desperate, unwavering devotion. He saw the Alpha who had climbed a rusted pillar for him, the captain who had turned his back and let him go, the man who had crossed a line of fire to kneel at his side. He had been running from this bond his entire life. Now, it was his only salvation. He gave a single, decisive nod. The sounds of combat echoed from the tunnels, the sharp crack of pulse rifles, the shouts of the stateless trying to defend their home. They had minutes, at most. Valerius wasted no time. He gently pushed Elian back onto the cot, his movements full of a reverence that bordered on worship. He leaned down, his face close to Elian's, and inhaled his scent, a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to draw the Omega's very essence into him. "I am yours, Elian," he murmured against his skin, the words a sacred vow. "I have always been yours." He lowered his head and pressed his lips to the scent gland on Elian's neck. It was not a kiss of passion, but of deep, resonant connection. And then he bit down. Not a savage, violent act, but a firm, possessive pressure. A claiming. A mark. Elian cried out, a sound that was equal parts pain and ecstatic release. A brilliant, blinding white light exploded behind his eyes. The bond, the frayed and damaged thread between them, ignited, reforged in an instant into an unbreakable cable of steel and starlight. He felt Valerius's essence, his strength, his regret, his absolute devotion pour into him, filling all the broken, empty spaces inside. The agonizing fire of his heat did not vanish, but it transformed. It coalesced, stabilized, becoming a deep, warm, and steady glow in his core. The fever receded. The weakness fled from his limbs. Strength, pure and potent, flooded his body. When Valerius lifted his head, his eyes were glowing with a fierce, protective light. The mark on Elian's neck was a proud, dark sigil, a declaration to the universe. My Alpha, my Omega, mine, forever. The fighting outside was getting closer. Can you stand? Valerius asked, his voice a low rumble. Elian swung his legs off the cot and rose to his feet. He felt whole. The trembling was gone. The dizziness was gone. He felt strong. He looked at Valerius, their bond now a living, breathing presence between them, a silent language they both understood perfectly. Where do we go? He asked. Valerius gave him a grim, determined smile. Out. Through them. He pulled his pulse rifle from his back, the gesture as natural as breathing. The captain was gone. The enforcer was gone. This was an alpha protecting his mate, and there was nothing in the universe more dangerous. They moved as one, a single entity linked by a bond that was now a weapon. Valerius took the lead, his body a shield, his movements economical and deadly. Elian followed a step behind, his senses preternaturally sharp, feeding Valerius a constant stream of information through their connection. The number of hostiles around the next corner, the direction of the heaviest fire, the hesitation of an enforcer before he pulled the trigger. They were a perfect, lethal synthesis of strategy and instinct. The stateless, seeing their captain turn on his own, rallied around them, their resistance no longer a desperate defense, but a coordinated counterattack. Anya appeared at their side, a pulse rifle in her hands, her face grim. The main gate is lost. They're pushing towards the geothermal vent. They mean to overload it, bring the whole cavern down. Is there another way out? Valerius barked, firing a precise shot that sent an enforcer tumbling from a gantry above. The old service shafts, Anya yelled over the din. They lead to the surface, miles from the city grid, but they're sealed. It would take hours to cut through. Hours they did not have. A new thought, cold and clear, entered Elian's mind. A solution born not of logic, but of the bond's deep, intuitive knowledge of his alpha. He grabbed Valerius's arm, the touch sending a jolt through their connection. The vigilance, he sent the thought, a pure, direct transmission of intent. Your command codes. We can't escape on foot. We have to escape in the sky. Valerius stared at him, his silver eyes wide with the audacity of the idea. Steal the Enforcer flagship? It was insane. It was impossible. It was perfect. A slow, wolfish grin spread across his face. Hold them off, he commanded Anya. Give us 10 minutes. He turned to Elian, his hand finding his, their fingers lacing together. Stay with me. Always, Elian replied, his voice steady. They broke from the main firefight, plunging into a side corridor that Valerius, using his knowledge of consortium schematics, knew led to a high-level comms relay. The passages were tight, the air thick with smoke and the smell of scorched metal. They were accosted by a lone enforcer, his helmet emblazoned with the insignia of Thorn's elite guard. He raised his rifle, his movements certain. "Captain Valerius, you are ordered to stand down. Surrender the asset." Valerius didn't hesitate. He moved in a blur, disarming the soldier with brutal efficiency, slamming him against the wall. He didn't kill him. He simply pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck in a precise nerve strike, and the enforcer slumped to the ground, unconscious. The lingering echo of the captain's training was still there, a reluctance to kill his own men. They reached the comms relay, a small humming room filled with glowing consoles. "The ship is in geostationary orbit," Valerius said, his fingers flying across a control panel, bypassing security lockouts with codes he was never meant to use. "I can't pilot it remotely, but I can trigger an emergency protocol, a medical evacuation." He input Elian's newly registered biometric signature, taken from their contact, and designated him as a high-value asset requiring immediate extraction. "It will dispatch a single, automated shuttle to the nearest surface extraction point," he explained. "It's our only way up." He finished typing, and a confirmation code flashed on the screen. A map appeared, highlighting an extraction point a quarter-mile from their position. A ventilation shaft on the surface, disguised as a municipal sculpture. An alarm blared on the console. "He's countering the command," Valerius swore, seeing Administrator Thorn's override codes flashing. "He's trying to lock me out." "He doesn't know about us," Elian said, placing his hand on Valerius's shoulder. He closed his eyes, focusing inward, pouring his will, his newfound strength, into the bond. He pushed it towards Valerius, a wave of pure, concentrated Omega energy, a support that was both psychic and spiritual. "We are stronger than him." Valerius felt the surge, a jolt of clarity and power that sharpened his focus, quickened his thoughts. His fingers moved faster, a blur of motion, weaving a web of code and countercode, fighting a silent digital war with the man in the sky. For a heart-stopping moment, Thorn's lockout held firm. Then, with a final, desperate command, Valerius smashed through. The screen flashed green. "Autonomous shuttle dispatched. ETA. 6 minutes." They ran. The path to the surface was a vertical climb up a rickety maintenance ladder, the air growing colder and thinner as they ascended. Below them, the sounds of the battle for sanctuary faded, replaced by the rush of the wind. They emerged into the perpetual twilight of the city, the grey, oppressive sky a welcome sight after the darkness below. The extraction point was a stark, angular sculpture in the center of a deserted plaza. The top of it began to retract, revealing the landing pad just as a sleek, black shuttle descended from the clouds, its engines silent. It was a beautiful, deadly promise of escape. But as the shuttle's ramp lowered, floodlights from the surrounding buildings snapped on, bathing the plaza in harsh, sterile white light. Figures emerged from the shadows, a full squad of Thorn's enforcers, their rifles leveled. And at their head, stepping from an armored transport, was Administrator Thorn himself, his face projected onto the visor of a sleek, powerful exosuit. "You have been a great disappointment, Captain," Thorn's amplified voice boomed across the plaza. "But your bond, your genetic flaw, it has provided a unique opportunity for study. Surrender, and the Omega will be given a comfortable cage." Valerius pushed Elian behind him, raising his rifle. They were surrounded, outgunned. This was the end of the line. But as he looked at Elian, at the fierce, unwavering trust in his eyes, at the proud mark on his neck, he knew he would not surrender. He would not go back to a cage. Neither of them would. They would die here, together, but they would die free. He felt Elian's hand on his back, a steady, calming pressure. Not the end, the thought came, clear and strong through their bond. The beginning. The shuttle ramp was open behind them. The sky was waiting. It was a choice, a cage or a fall. Together, they chose the fall.